Today we're talking about a strategy to get onto the property ladder that seems really clever on the face of it, but is actually deeply flawed. If you've been wondering how to play the system, you might have come across this idea or something similar yourself. And today we're going to explain why it probably won't work.
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for you to become an educated home buyer.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. But it's a good thing because between us we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on. Allow us to guide you on your home buying journey. We want you to become an educated home buyer so that you can stop looking for your first home and actually become a proud homeowner.
We've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au, and there you'll get access to our free mini course, How to Price a Property Like a Professional. You will also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to become educated home buyers. We created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, we've got the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording. Things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority and your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today, we're talking about a clever idea to maximise your borrowing capacity by combining forces with another buyer and choosing a high growth or hot area to buy in to give you what you think might be a huge leg up on the property ladder. Now, it's clever, all right, but only in theory. In practice, it's extremely risky, and we're going to explain why in this episode.
The inspiration for this episode comes from a question from one of our Facebook group members, and it's such a great question, we immediately knew that we had to dedicate an episode to it. So here's the question. You want to go, Megan? Read it?
Yep. What do you think of buying with a sibling or friend or parent for a short-term hold in a hot or warm area in order to grow my equity faster and sooner before buying a more appropriate long-term property? Now, I really want to stress that this is a short-term strategy question as opposed to a question about whether you should invest or buy with a sibling or a parent or friend.
Correct. Yes. And even if you're going to do this on your own, we're not hugely in favour of it because whilst on paper, it just seems like a perfect strategy because if you can sort of sit down there and sort of go, right, well, I buy here, then prices go up, then I sell and I go and buy over there where prices didn't go up. And then all of a sudden, yay, I'm doing it all right. Well, it's funny. The only way it will work is if luck is in your corner. Right. So I won't say
luck is not a strategy.
Luck is definitely not a strategy. And you know what? Some people might actually luck it. They might make it work. And I've come across people that have. But luck is so damn risky to build on that. And so we're going to go through why, right?
Yeah.
Why it's on paper great, but not so great in practice.
Yeah, because look, the property market doesn't play by the rules. It doesn't go, okay, well, I'll go hard here and I'll go soft there. You can't, every expert under the sun, and you do the full forecaster report every year, and some might get it right, some might not get it right. That being the whole point, right? It's a bit of a gamble to say which way you think the property market's going to go. Even though there is a huge amount of property data available, it's actually impossible to predict with any certainty exactly which markets will boom and when, and which ones will be flat or be in decline and for how long.
And this is, I've been in the game 25 years now, and I can think of some of the properties that I've purchased and sold along the ways, and sometimes I've managed to buy perfectly, but only knew that in retrospect.
Yes.
Other times
that is a wonderful thing.
Other times I've managed to sell, in fact, not so well as I might have been able to, but I had different decision-making factors. The simple fact is that in theory I could choose the right time to sell as well, but the conditions of that particular year might not fulfill what I'm trying to achieve. You know, they don't play along because Veronica decides she wants to sell a property. So
Could you not have that influence?
no, I'd love to, but no, even I, with all my my hot air and all the rest of it, I can't do that. So for this whole strategy to work, all of these things we're going to run through in a moment need to happen in exactly this order.
Yeah. All right. So remember, we're talking about buying in a hot market for short-term gain, as opposed to making any comment about whether buying with a sibling, parent, friend, or other person is a good idea or not, right? So for the purpose of this exercise, we'll assume that your friend, your sibling, or whoever it is prepared to do everything you say when you say to do it, right? But how likely is that?
Yes. So we could do, and maybe we should do another whole episode on buying with someone else, your first property. That's not the crux of this question. You know, the question here is like, I might have an opportunity to actually buy now because I obviously can't buy now otherwise. But if I put money in with someone else, we can buy. And if we do this, then when we sell that, we're going to be able to go and use that money to buy the home that we really want to buy. So that's the sort of the thinking behind this. So the first thing that has to go perfectly for this to just roll out dream-like is that you need to be able to identify a location that is at the very beginning of a sharp growth curve.
Yeah, good luck.
Yep.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Hindsight, as we said, is a wonderful thing because, this is easier said than done. And there's a real reason for that. And that is because data lags. And what we mean by that is what sells on Saturday, unless you are there on the spot, you know exactly what the sale price was, you know how many offers there were or bidders at the auction, you're actually collecting data at the coalface in the moment and analysing that data yourself. What's reported out of some of the data houses and then fed into the media is often a good 3 months behind. And the reason for that is a property might transact on the 1st of the month, but it might not settle until the 30th of the month or the middle of the next month. So that's when data actually registers Department of Natural Resources or whatever the name of in each state. Then the data houses get access to that information. So then they put it through their analytics and then feed back out in a report to the media. So that can be 2 to 3 months after the actual event has taken place. So, even experts can't predict when that's going to happen with any sort of success rate, I would say.
And there are a lot of data specialists who are looking for hotspots around the country. There's no doubt about it. And even those, I have Megan referred earlier to Fuller Forecaster Report, and I have in different reports looked back at predictions being made by data experts 10 years earlier and worked out what proportion of those had actually come true. And I can honestly tell you nowhere near 100%. Nowhere near 100%, right? So, but if you do happen to luck it, right, you do manage to go, you know what, this is poised for growth. I'm going to get in on the ground floor. Yeehaw. You got to be able to get a really good asset. You got to know what's a good one versus what's a crap one. And, early entrants can make really good gains. I know I spoke to people over the years that got into Hobart at the very beginning of its boom. And as long as they sold at the right point, which is next, right, they could realise those gains. But if they don't sell at the right point, then they're going to suffer for the period of time where you're going to loss-making territory, which is where Hobart is at the minute. But the thing is, too, that once these hotspots, once the word spreads about them, those gains are actually baked into the price. So those early people do make those initial gains because no one's paying for the fact that it's a hotspot early on. But then as soon as word gets out there, people are starting to compete for properties in those areas because they want to get into this growing market. And yes, they can still make money if the boom goes for a long time, but they're going to make less money than the early entrants.
Yeah. And picking that point, we can see some early indicators when we are feet on the ground. Veronica, I know you would see it with the number of people that are at auctions or how many people are bidding or do prices start to creep slightly above. You've really got to be feet on the ground for this to work. You can't sort of sit in Sydney and say, I can see a hot spot in, I don't know, Longreach, for want of a better place. Don't know that there's not many households in Longreach. But do you know what I mean? Like you can't actually be sitting looking at asking Google or ChatGPT or Copilot, where's the next hotspot? Because it's only drawing data from anyone that's put anything on the internet. And as we know, anyone can put anything on the internet. So you've got to be feet on the ground to see the early indicators of when a market is moving up or down or steady or falling off the edge of a cliff.
And you can go and buy one of those reports. You can buy a report that's telling you which of the areas next to take off. But as I said to you, they don't all take off.
Yeah.
You know, so you go and believe one of them, sink your money into them, and you go, what happened to that one? You know, so it's very, very difficult to know that exact market. But let's say you did. Let's say that you did identify that market. You got in on the ground floor. You're looking at this enormous gain. That's fantastic. The next thing that has to go perfectly right is that you need to know exactly when to sell.
Yeah. You need to time it perfectly.
Flawlessly.
Because if you miss that moment when the market's peaking and it ends up tipping over into decline, then you have missed potentially all of the buyers, particularly if the buyers pull out of the market suddenly. And I did this, the very first flip renovation that I did back in 2002. I bought a property to flip. The market was hot. Renovation took a little bit longer than I expected. You know, I was so new to real estate at this point in time. And the market turned before I got that property on the market. And I made a loss on it. So, you know, what should have been a rapidly rising, hot, heated market, 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, highly sought after area, I made a loss on because I didn't know how to pick the change at that point in time.
Yeah.
And I was relying on it to keep rising.
And this is a thing too. We have this thing called recency bias where we actually think, well, whatever's been happening recently is going to keep happening. And so it's very hard to go, that's it, I'm calling the top of the market, because you think, oh, but what if there's a bit more growth in it? I'll be an idiot to get out of that. Like human nature won't allow us to make really good decisions. And if it's a boom bust market, right, we're talking not just a decline where all the buyers start dissipating. We're talking about a crash in particular areas where there's, you know, mining towns are a classic example of this. Heaps of people bought into mining towns about 12, 14 years ago, and they just didn't think that prices could fall, let alone plummet. In some of those mining towns, prices today are not anywhere near where they were at their peaks. So,
absolutely.
And there's people that are stuck and trapped in these, they can't afford their debt prisoners, basically, because they owe more money than the property is worth. So that's at its extreme, the risk of not getting out of these
some
markets.
Of those places were on hotspotting reports, right?
They were. I know.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I know. I know. It's shocking. The other thing too is that if you are buying a property that you're not going to live in, because we're assuming this is an investment as well, right? Because, you know, you got into partnership with somebody. And so if it's an investment property, in order to time the sale, you have to be thinking, can I sell it with the tenant living in the property? If not, I have to work out, well, at what point can I give the tenant notice? How much notice do I have to give? And in many jurisdictions, that's a 3-month process in itself. So you got to give the tenant notice, wait 90 days, different rules, different states. But so in New South Wales, for example, say it's 90 days, you've got to give them 90 days. You wait 90 days, then you start to get the marketing campaign up and running. You know, you're pushing it out. The market can change in that time.
Absolutely.
And it can change. And when it does change, it's like it grows, it builds up slowly, and that happens suddenly. So again, trying to time that, absolutely calibrate that perfectly when to sell, that has to go perfectly for this strategy to work.
It does. And just to, you know, expand on your point there about timing, you know, you're right. If this is going to be people who are not living in the property, even if one person lives in the property and the other person doesn't, then, you know, we're going to talk about the tax impacts of that shortly. But there is, unless you can be perfectly and 100% fluid in your ability to sell the property, so you can, one, time it well. You've got that ability. You've got the crystal ball. You know when things are peaking, and you've got the ability to be extremely fluid and flexible on the date that you actually get that property on the market. So you're extraordinarily good at predicting, and you've got that flexibility. So no tenant in place, you can move in a heartbeat, or the person that's living in the property can move in a heartbeat. All that has to align perfectly for timing the market to work.
Yeah. So the third thing that will need to go to plan is that the gains you made by timing the market so perfectly, they actually need to be astronomical, not just great, because you will have to pay capital gains tax. So you're going to lose a big chunk of that. And also the selling costs, which could be roughly 3 to 4% of the sale price. So I've put together a little scenario here just to illustrate this and make you, illustrate how, ultimately you go, is it worth it?
Yeah.
So
let's run through it. And I want to say, the example that we're presenting here is based on a 6-year time frame. Now that I don't think is a long term at all.
No.
And I suspect that the question was asked with a much shorter time frame in mind. Much shorter time frame.
Yeah.
But let's work with this for now. So say, for example, you bought a $600,000 property and doubled your money in 6 years. Well done. That was well timed on paper.
And that is that's possible in some markets, but highly irregular and a huge return. I just want to really labour that point. Possible.
That is
a big
lucky,
return.
not necessarily good preparation. But anyway, and if you'd bought it as an investment, you wouldn't have any first home buyer grants or incentives, no stamp duty concessions and so forth. Investors do not get concessions on stamp duty. So let's say your purchasing costs are about $30,000 and you went halves with your co-purchaser. Let's call it your brother for the sake of this one.
Yeah. So after 6 years, after 6 years, you sell it for $1.2 million because it's doubled in value, right? The selling process costs you $40,000, both of you together. The capital gain for you both is $530,000 because remember the cost to buy the property was $30,000. So the capital gain at the end of it all is $530,000, and each of you made gross before tax $265,000. So that's your net gain, if you like. Gross capital gain before tax. And I'm also not factoring in depreciation. I'm not complicating it by looking at interest costs or anything like that. We'll talk about that in a sec. But this is just top line stuff, right? So you get a capital gains tax discount of 50%, which means that you made that gross gain of $265,000. So that comes down to $132,500. And that is the amount of money you're going to have to pay tax on. Now, because we have different tax scales in this country, the maximum threshold is $190,000. If you're earning $190,000 in any tax year, you're going to have to pay 45% on every dollar over $190,000. Right? So there's scales, right? So the point that I want to point here is that if you're going to make a gain of $132,500 and your salary is under $57,500, that keeps you under that $190,000 tax threshold. And what that means is that you'll be paying 37 cents of tax for every one of those dollars, basically. Now, you could get in the nitty-gritty. We are not tax specialists, but I just wanted to sort of point out that if you have a higher base salary, you're going to get less of that money in your pocket because you're going to be paying a higher rate of tax. And just to illustrate this, these figures might be slightly inaccurate because I'm not an accountant, but they give you the idea. All right, a quick interruption. If you are watching the video, you will no doubt notice that Megan has suddenly disappeared and you're hearing and seeing just me. There's a reason for that, and that we made a mistake in our calculations in our first recording of this episode. Thank you to our listener who pointed this out to us so very quickly, in fact, on the day that we released it. So thank you for that. We've been able to jump in, make amends, fix the calculation, and come back to you. So here we go. The least amount of tax that you will pay in this scenario is 37%. And if your salary is over $57,500, you'll be paying $45,000 on some of that gain. So what this means is that your largest gain after tax would be $215,975. Right. Now, that is a lot of money. But if your salary is $80,000, for example, your after-tax gain will be a little bit less, $214,175. And if your salary is $100,000, your after-tax gain will be $212,575. So what this illustrates is that if your income, your base income is higher, then you're going to be paying more tax, and so the end result in your pocket is going to be less. Now, of course, $200,000 over a 6-year period is nothing to be sniffed at. In fact, if you can time everything perfect and achieve that, that's fantastic. But what we're talking about in this episode is risk. The odds of you doing that are extremely low. And we're also assuming, for the purposes of this illustration, that you are cash flow neutral for the purposes of this example, right? But that's unlikely with a 20% deposit, and you're also highly unlikely to get great capital gains as well as high rents. In fact, if we rerun this scenario with the assumption that most property planners use in their property plans, and that is a 7% per annum average growth rate, and what that means is if you have 7.2% per annum, then your property will double in value every 10 years. And so that is an assumption that is broadly used in the industry. We don't love that, by the way, because there's always fluctuations. But if you're going to use that, it's probably more realistic than saying it's going to double every 6. We've been really generous in that example. And also, if you did this over a shorter period of time, say 4 years, you'd be looking at a potential gross capital gain of $116,000 on that $600,000 purchase, which is $58,000 each before you pay tax, right? And also expenses. So a possible gain before expenses and after tax would be around about the $47,000 mark each for each of you. And you'd have to subtract costs from that, such as interest, payments, maintenance, management fees, insurance, etc. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is risk. And I really cannot stress this enough. Everything had to be going absolutely perfect for you to make that money. And we really, really want to encourage first home buyers to not take huge risks with their deposit money, and certainly not to take huge risks with their first property.
You really, really have to understand your in costs, your out costs, capital gains tax implications, holding costs during that time, losses, all of those sorts of things have to cut. It's just not as simple as I doubled my money in 6 years.
6 years. No, not at all.
Yeah.
And you do have to ask yourself other questions, because there are a lot of what ifs. There's a what if the market you wanted to buy your family home in also went up by the same amount.
Yeah. So you've actually ended up with less money out of this transaction potentially than you might have had if you'd actually bought into the area that you wanted to live in long term.
And look, I know that this scenario is coming up because you probably can't afford to buy there yet. But I guess what a lot of people, when we ask share market investors, financial planners, and the question's often asked, which I've heard this question asked many, many times, should I invest my deposit in the share market, while I'm saving, basically? And the answer invariably from share market experts is no, because it's risky and you might lose it. And I guess we're saying the same thing here. It's risky, and everything has to turn out perfectly for you to make even a small gain in the whole scheme of things. And you might actually go the complete opposite, because what if the market you bought into had a downturn in that time period instead, and your money got stuck there while other markets were growing?
Yeah. And that is a massive risk. So remember, all these scenarios we were sort of mapping out based on you doing everything perfectly. And there is no perfect playbook in property, because there are so many things that you don't know could possibly come up. Interest rate changes, economic conditions, change in government, could be a change in policy. There could be a change in buffers for lending. There could be markets that rise, markets that fall. There could be an increase in population growth. There could be a decrease in population. So all of these factors take away the perfection of prediction and the ability to time. So it's pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
to time the market this perfectly if you have a short-term strategy. Now, we were talking about a 6-year example there. I suspect that the example or the question was based on more like a 1, 2 or 3-year time frame, which, if you think about what potential gain you might make in that time, how much you might be left over with afterwards, could you have saved that actually in that time period without the risk?
The other thing too, we're talking about timing the market's pretty much impossible when you're trying to time one market. But for this scenario to work, you actually need to be perfectly timing 2 markets. Talking about increasing complexity and the level of risk of it not working out. And I think fundamentally, that's why we say that this is a terrible idea. We love the theory, but in practice, it isn't going to fly.
It's high risk for a first home buyer, let's say that.
Yeah. And if it pays off, great. But honestly, you're blowing everything. It's like being on the, I don't know, I don't play blackjack, but it's a bit like throwing all your chips, or in roulette. It's like throwing all your chips on one tiny number. And I'm not that risk averse. I'm way more risk averse, I should say. I'm not that much a risk taker.
Yep. Absolutely. Now, have you joined our Facebook group yet? It's called Your First Home Buyer Guide Australia. This is one of the questions that our members pose to us and we answered personally. It's your opportunity to connect with us and ask us your questions. You'll get answers from us, which means you can be sure you're not going to be led down the garden path.
And a quick note, you might think that we cover everything you need to know in these podcasts, but a word of warning, we don't. We just scratch the surface in each episode. If you really want to be an educated first home buyer, you need to learn all of the steps, how to put everything in order and do everything in the right order.
Yeah, absolutely. Our first home buyer course only costs $990 and you get direct access to us to help guide you through your negotiations. You can also share the link of any property you're thinking of buying and we can help you work out whether it's an A, B, C grade or an absolute no-go zone. Trust me, you'll buy better with our guidance and you'll overpay by a lot more than $1,000 if you don't know what you're doing.
In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out Your First Home Buyer Guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you've found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.